Hey, it's Mark Ferguson with Invest for More. And this video, we're going to talk about haunted houses, murder houses, and not just my murder rooms I joke about, but actual murder houses, and what you have to disclose based on what happened in a house before. So we flipped a number of houses. We bought a lot of houses for rentals, had a lot of different and weird properties throughout the years. This is one that we sold a few years ago. And everybody who was in that house who kind of believes in haunted stuff or ghosts or whatever swore this house was haunted. And later on, I actually talked to somebody, which was a complete surprise, who said the same thing as well. So we'll talk about that, and if you have to disclose it or not. And speaking of that, that was something weird that just went across the camera that's watching. We'll also talk about murder houses and crimes committed in houses, and whether you have to disclose that or not. And we'll talk about kind of a famous case in Colorado a little bit about the value of that house after a pretty awful crime was committed there. And even if you do or don't disclose it, how crime can impact the value of houses as well. This house we bought from an agent who contacted me directly because she knew we bought houses, flipped houses, or bought houses that needed work. And for whatever reason, they didn't want to put it on the market. They didn't want to list it. The sellers just wanted to sell it directly to an investor. So we saw the house, looked at it, came up with a price. We agreed on it, and we purchased the property. We came through, remodeled it, did a lot of work on this property. It was no longer pink. We'll show you what it looks like after we were done. It was a really nice house after we finished everything up. But the thing was, during this remodel, our contractors swore there was a ghost in the house. It was an older gentleman, and I can't remember the name, but they told me the name and just swore they were always messing with him, doing stuff, turning off lights, turning off equipment, things like that. So I personally don't really believe in that stuff. If I did, I probably wouldn't buy a lot of the houses and properties that I do buy, or they might freak me out. But, you know, the weird thing about this was we sold this house later on after we fixed it up. And then I think it was I was going to the dentist, and the dentist assistant was talking about houses and different things, and it was in a different town than this. And they're like, oh yeah, my in-laws or somebody bought a house here. I'm like, oh, is it on this street? And like, yeah. I'm like, oh, I actually sold the house right next door or something. Like, oh, yeah, we know that people who bought that house too. And they're just like, that house is so haunted. It is the most haunted house we've ever known. I'm like, oh, really? And I hadn't said anything about that, talked to them about that or anything, but they were adamant that this house was haunted as well. Again, I don't really believe in that stuff. I don't know if, the neighbors came and talked to them, or if the neighbors were talking to our contractors. There could have been any number of reasons that had happened. But it was odd that came up. And they said whoever lived there loved the house, and they're actually like friends with the ghost and didn't mind them. But they were adamant that it was haunted. Now, this house did have hardwood floors underneath, and we'll show you what it looks like when we are done with it, because old hardwood floors are pretty cool when they're in good shape. So what happens in a situation like this where a house is haunted? Well, in most states, almost everywhere, you don't have to disclose that. There's no reason to tell people you think a house is haunted. It's just, some people believe it, some don't. There's really no way to prove it, so it's kind of hard to say if a house is haunted or not. Now, with disclosure, so I guess we should talk about that first. If you sell a house, even if you've owned it as a rental, you've never been in it, and you know material facts about the house, you are required by law to disclose them. So let's say it had a water main break and it was leaking water underground. You have to disclose that to the buyers because it's a material fact. It could impact the value. If you knew that the city was going to build a highway next door to your house and tear down a bunch of houses, that would be a massive material fact about the property that could increase the value. You'd have to disclose that. And a lot of people, we see property disclosures, we see people write on there, never lived in the property, don't know anything about it. Well, you probably still know about the property even if you didn't live there. And it doesn't matter if you live there or not. If you know material facts about the property, you still have to disclose them. Now in Colorado, you don't have to fill out a property disclosure. You don't have to include that, although it's highly recommended. But even if you don't fill it out and you still know things about the property, you still have to disclose them, tell potential buyers, hey, this and this and this. You know, if you know the house has lead-based paint in it, you have to let them know that. If you know the sewer line is broken, you have to disclose that. But with things like hauntings and crime, it gets a little trickier because, as we just said, you don't always know if a house is haunted because some people believe it, some don't. There's no real proof on that fact. And crime is difficult too, or deaths are difficult too, because it's like, well, someone could have died in this house in 1910. How are we supposed to know that? How are you supposed to keep disclosing that? How long do you disclose that? It's hard to say. And there's also different laws in different states. So we're in Colorado. My laws are different than New York or California or Utah. Every state has its own laws on what you have to disclose and not disclose. And we'll talk about the crime and murder thing later on with another property I bought. So for hauntings, there's really nowhere you have to disclose if a house is haunted or not, or you suspect it's haunted, except for a few specific instances. There was a case in New York in 1991 where someone was advertising a house, not advertising, sorry. They were selling a house, but while they'd lived there, they'd always advertised it as being haunted. They had ghost tours. They told all the neighbors. They basically told everyone, this is a haunted house, there's ghosts. They tried to make it an attraction. And the buyers did not know this. They bought the house. They came around, sued the sellers when they figured this out by talking to the neighbors and after they moved in, and said, hey, you should have disclosed this. So while there's no law saying you have to disclose if a house is haunted or not, the judge sided with the buyers and said that it's not the specific haunting that you had to disclose, but it's the fact that you advertised it as being haunted, told all the neighbors, and used it as an attraction to draw people in. You gave the house kind of some notoriety and made it a landmark for being haunted in the area, which could adversely affect its value. Now, that's New York. You know, it could have been different in a different state with the same case and different judges. Who knows? But if you advertise something, use it as a business, try to make a house, you know, appear as something to the public, you might need to disclose that. So that's something to think about. I did not disclose this house was haunted because, like I said, I don't really believe in that. I know my contractors were 100% sure of it, and it sounds like the new owner may have been 100% sure of it. But again, I don't know who told them what or how they figured that out, or if something happened, or, you know, if the neighbors are constantly telling you a house is haunted and you believe in hauntings, you might start looking for things that make it haunted. Again, there's different ways to look at it. So the haunting side of it is a little, you know, pretty cut and dry unless you start advertising it, trying to make a property something of a local celebrity. Now, for murder houses, that is something else a little different and even a little trickier. This was the murder church I bought. So I bought this from a wholesaler, and they told me about the property. I went and saw it. It's a very weird property. Basically had no kitchen, one bedroom, strange layout. And they never mentioned this to me or told this to me, but someone had recently been murdered here, like pretty recently. And so I learned that from my title company, who saw the address and said, for some reason, they recognized that address and knew that a son had actually killed his mother in this property not that long ago. And so after finding that out, I'm like, oh, do I want to deal with that? Do I want to buy a property like that? Is a good deal. I decided to go forward with it. Now, in Colorado, you do not have to disclose crimes or murders or deaths. In other states, you do. So that was what makes it tricky, is different states have different laws. However, in this case, we did decide to put it in the property disclosure that happened, just to be safe and cover ourselves. It actually sold right away with no issues. So this is one where it's tricky and hard to say what's right or what's wrong, or if it impacts value or not, depending on the crime, depending on how long ago it happened, depending on the severity. All of those different things can really impact the value of a property. So, in this case, it definitely made news. It was in the papers, but it wasn't like, state news or national news or anything like that. It's pretty much a local matter. I'm sure a lot of the neighbors knew what happened. I'm sure they were aware of it, but a lot of people outside of this small town might not have been aware of it. And, I don't really know if it really impacts the value of the property that much, just because it wasn't a huge story and probably not, wasn't a wide range of people who were aware of what happened. It also wasn't like it's hard to say. I mean, there are much worse crimes that have occurred before. It's obviously awful and a horrible crime, but it, that sort of thing happens, whereas some other crimes can be absolutely crazy and really get a lot of attention. So I'm not trying to say it wasn't an awful crime, it wasn't horrible, but domestic incidents happen, unfortunately, too often. And so it wasn't something that was, on CNN or anything like that, is what I'm trying to say. So we decided to buy it, went through with it, repaired the house, fixed it up, sold it, and didn't have an issue. So this one worked out fine for us. But on another house deal, I had a wholesaler or someone come to me wanting to sell me a nationally televised Netflix story house to me at a big discount. The Chris Watts house, where I won't go into too many details on it because it's just awful, but basically killed his whole family in the house, and house went into foreclosure. I think, were they trying to sell it to me as a short sale? I'm not sure, maybe after the foreclosure. And so I just saw recently that house sold again. So it just sold in October of 2024. And that one, you may want to disclose, right? Even if it's not required, you want to disclose that. And that one also had a massive, massive impact on the value of the home because of the crime, because of the national attention it got. With that house, I did find the address. It wasn't published anywhere, and I'm not going to publish that address either or tell you where it was. But I was able to find it with just a little bit of research on my part and being an agent and having access to the MLS system and different things. And it sold for $650,000 in October. It was over 6,000 square feet, a big house. And I just looked at some comps in the area just to get an idea of like, okay, is this about what stuff is selling for? Is this way less? And I would estimate the value on that house would probably be $850,000, maybe more, if it was a normal regular sale. And the pictures, everything, it looked like it was in good shape, remodeled. I didn't see any mention of it in the MLS comments. I didn't see a property disclosure, so I don't know if they mentioned it there, what happened. But because it was such a national story, they made a television, a Netflix series about it, was all over the place. Almost everyone in Colorado would recognize the names and what happened there. That might be one where if you didn't disclose it and the buyers came back and said, hey, this was a material fact, even though Colorado law states you don't have to disclose crime or deaths, this was such a huge case that it was still a material fact that impacted value. So that could be one where, even though the law says one thing, it still could be a material fact based on just the size of that story. So there's a lot of different things to consider with houses and disclosure. Usually you're just better off disclosing as much as you can. If you aren't sure whether to disclose or not, disclose it anyway. And if it's an issue to the buyer, so be it. Maybe it's not an issue to the buyer. You never know. So that's our story. These are a couple of houses that we had to deal with a possible haunting and, a definite murder and how they turned out. There's some interesting stuff out there. So let me know what you think. Let me know if you have any interesting stories in different subjects like this. And you can always tell me if you believe in haunted houses or not. And if you think any of my properties that you've seen were haunted. I know I've been in a few properties that were definitely creepy and felt really weird. Part of them might be because I thought maybe, someone might jump out and murder me who wasn't a ghost, but a real person. And for other issues, like maybe I was going to fall through the floor or the roof was going to cave in on me. So all kinds of different things going on some of the properties we buy. All right, thanks for watching. We'll be back soon.